Welcome to the Yemen Brief podcast, the place to turn for informed insight about what's happening in Yemen. This podcast is brought to you by the team at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. I'm الشماحي, a researcher at the Sana'a Center, and your host for today's episode of our ongoing series discussing Yemen with experts and interesting individuals from the country and around the world. The world's worst humanitarian crisis, and a country on the verge of famine. That's how Yemen has been described by the United Nations and other international organizations over the past few years, a direct result of the war in the country. It's a narrative that's raised billions of dollars in aid for the country with the aim of alleviating the suffering of the Yemeni people. But how accurate is that description? And how effective has the international humanitarian response been? We're joined today by Sara Fowilisteki, who worked for the UN's World Food Programme in Yemen, as well as other international organizations globally. In her paper for the Sana'a Center, When Aid Goes Awry, which can be found on our website, sana'acenter.org, she argues, based on interviews with dozens of humanitarian workers, analysts, donors, and civil society representatives, that the international humanitarian response is failing Yemen. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. Let's start with the top line, perhaps. The world's worst humanitarian crisis. Does the data support this? And if not, why?
Thank you very much, first of all, for letting me be a guest on the podcast. Very happy to be here today. It's actually a very difficult question, what you ask, because to say something is the world's worst crisis is a very simple statement, but it's actually a very complex issue. What do we mean when we talk about the worst crisis? What indicators are we talking about, and how do we measure them? And a big question with that is, how reliable is the data that we use to inform these indicators? How are we able to independently collect, see, and verify this data? When we talk about worst, do we talk about absolute or relative? For example, Yemen is a very big country. So de facto, there's always going to be very big absolute numbers. But then you can have a country like South Sudan, which is much smaller, which relatively could have worse indicators. So how do we decide what's worse is a really big question. And it's something that hasn't really been answered within the sector on how to measure this. And also, what is most important? Do we talk about food security? Do we talk about disease, water availability, displacement? These are all things that are not clear when we talk about the worst crisis in the world. That said, as you mentioned, Yemen is very often described in the public sphere as the worst crisis globally in terms of humanitarian indicators. This is what we hear all the time. But when we did the research for this report, and we asked humanitarian aid workers who have experience in many other places, many of them actually questioned whether this is actually true based on what they see and what they feel in comparison to other places that they have worked in. So what we ended up doing was a very quick comparison on main indicators such as food security, such as displacement, civilian casualties, to kind of throw this question into the light, not necessarily with a clear answer. If you look at people in need, as I said, Yemen is always going to produce very big numbers because it's a country with a high population. But compared to other countries, in terms of, for example, South Sudan or Syria, relatively, in terms of people in need versus whole population, that percentage is actually less. If we look at food security, especially considering that WFP and OCHA and other international organizations often say that Yemen is on the brink of a famine and one step away from disaster, we actually have to say that maybe this isn't correct. If you look at the data, Yemen actually improved food security by 15%, which is the largest improvement that has been seen globally. If you look at the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they actually have the biggest absolute number of people in food insecurity right now. It's also estimated that Syria, at this point in time, per capita, has worse food insecurity. Same for displacement. If you look at displacement, neither relatively nor in absolute terms is there more displacement in Yemen. In terms of civilian casualties, we see that Yemen actually projects the lowest number of civilian casualties if you compare it to other crises such as Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan. And if you're talking about security in terms of worst humanitarian crisis, it's also not even in the top 5 countries that records incidents against aid workers. So if you look at the data that is available and the impressions on the ground, it doesn't seem to be worse than other crises. But that kind of brings up the question of on what is that data based, as I mentioned before. A key issue that was identified in the research of this report was the lack of reliable data in Yemen. So therefore, how can we really trust on what is being presented?
I was going to say, I think so. We'll jump into the data actually a bit later on. But just in terms of the humanitarian response, just in terms of the claim itself, why do you think that claim has been promoted, and how does that impact the humanitarian response in Yemen? Because surely, if the claim is inaccurate, it still serves to bring attention to Yemen and send money there. So is there a harm specifically, or does these kind of claims actually impact the humanitarian response?
I think it has a huge impact on the humanitarian response. I think a very important question to ask ourselves, and what should probably be asked of the international agencies projecting this narrative, is what is the underlying reason for projecting this narrative? And if you ask people about this, what their thoughts are, because I can't tell you that 100% for sure. Only New York or Rome, the headquarters, can tell you that. But very often it comes down to money. Because at the end of the day, projecting the narrative that Yemen is the world's humanitarian crisis in the world has led to an incredible fundraising campaign and one of the best marketing campaigns ever seen in the humanitarian sector, and has brought in a huge amount of money. I mean, it has raised 17 billion in over 5 years between 2015 and 2020. Yemen has received 14% of the global funds for humanitarian relief. And you really see that as this narrative begins to grow about it being the worst crisis, how the funds grow exponentially with that narrative. For example, in 2015, $1.8 billion was given to the response. That was almost double by 2017, reaching 5.2 billion in 2019. But you also have to understand that this fundraising is also institutionally very important for the response and the organizations themselves, because money is largely equated with success. So if you manage a country office or you manage a program in Yemen, you have the cachet of working in the worst response in the world, supposedly, as well as managing probably the largest program and the largest country office in the world. And that gives a lot of status, both institutionally and personally, for people. We also have to consider support costs. Every single humanitarian, well, this is specifically for the United Nations, every single office has to pay institutional support to headquarters for the support it gives to the field. So the bigger your response and the bigger your office, the more of that budget also goes to headquarters and regional offices as institutional response costs. So you kind of get this institutional investment on both an organizational and personal level in really maintaining this narrative. And at the end of the day, crisis sells because it's exciting, it's in your face, and the worst crisis sells better than being the second crisis. But the impact of that is that it's, at the end of the day, it's really dangerously very, very simplistic, because the focus then becomes on maintaining this narrative in which there is institutional investment to have it continue be the worst crisis, because then you will continue to get the most money. So the focus and the efforts will continue to go to proving the fact that Yemen is the worst crisis in the world, rather than having an honest and open debate about what the problems are in Yemen, what this has caused, and what do people need to resolve this crisis. It's been very clearly shown through a report that was issued last year through the Protection Cluster and the Danish Refugee Council, that's found that the most vulnerable people in Yemen, women, the Muhammadin, the disabled, the elderly, are still the most excluded from aid. So therefore, the humanitarian response with all this money isn't actually getting to the most vulnerable because it's not focusing on the right things. And we found this during the interviews with people in Yemen, that they very much found this. Everybody found that the aid that was given was inappropriate. It wasn't in line with what they needed and wanted. For example, if you've been displaced multiple times, you finally found somewhere to stay, receiving multiple instances of temporary shelter kits is not going to help your situation. Food security in Yemen is, for example, it's very much driven by economics. It's the economy, not necessarily the availability. Therefore, throwing food distributions and wheat and oil into this is not necessarily the best solution. But nobody's willing to have an honest debate on what the actual solution is, because the investment is in this narrative of humanitarian crisis.
So if the money has been, we're talking about huge amounts of money here, and yet the issues you're describing are, in effect, how the humanitarian response has been failing. You've already described, I guess, in some way why the humanitarian response has failed. But I guess, what are those solutions? What does need to be done to address the humanitarian response and actually improve it and make it better?
Well, I think the first thing that really needs to be done is to have an honest and open debate about whether the response that has taken place has actually achieved its goals. And if it hasn't, why has it not?
Now, are there some other obstacles, perhaps, when we look at the humanitarian response?
Yes, I think that one other issue that has definitely affected the humanitarian response is the politicization of the aid within the wider Yemen crisis. The inclusion of aid of humanitarian response, for example, within the Stockholm Agreement, and for example, within the joint declaration that Martin Griffiths and his team tried to pass last year, I think that has definitely been to the detriment of humanitarian aid, because it has meant that aid and politics have become intertwined. Conditioning any political response on humanitarian aid very often means that then that gets included within a political sphere and political negotiations, and then inhibits actually being able to do a response from a humanitarian side, because it's then political. So, for example, any aids, we had an issue, for example, around Hodeidah, where we were trying to bring food distributions to Durrani Governorate, but the coalition was confused about the fact that it was Durrani Governorate and not Durrani City, so kept rejecting the delivery because it was seen to be political at the time because of the status of Durrani City. So it took a really long time and really delayed getting aid into the governorate because of this politicization around that. And then I think also on a very practical level, sometimes because there is limited space, and we particularly saw this in the data, there was limited space in Hodeidah for humanitarians to be there. But with the arrival of the political mission, that space had to be shared, and it became a very big discussion on who would take priority to be in Hodeidah, the political mission or the humanitarians, because there wasn't enough space for both. And that led to humanitarians actually being sent out of Hodeidah and there not being space for them, therefore directly inhibiting response. And I think a last point that I think is important to note is that really one of the failures in Yemen has been a lack of humanitarian leadership and courage and unwillingness to stand up for what is right. What we have really seen in Yemen is a lack of support for a good operational culture, for honest debates, for protection of staff that are out there trying to make a difference, trying to move, trying to create space. What we've often seen is that, for example, detentions of both national and international staff will go uncommented on and will not lead to repercussions on authorities. So there's been a really strong unwillingness to draw red lines from humanitarian leadership, which has really led to the constricting of operational space. Because if the humanitarian operation is unable or unwilling to protect a humanitarian operations, its independence, its impartiality, its neutrality, then at the end of the day, there is no space to do our work. And if we constantly allow these infringements on staff, on our operations, on our activities, and there is never a line drawn, then at the end of the day, there is no space left to work.
So let's perhaps then go back to the data, which we spoke about earlier. Now, the report did speak about poor quality of data to understand humanity. I said the report does speak about the poor quality of data that's used to understand the humanitarian crisis and that contributing to the problem. What solutions can be found specifically for the data collection challenges, and how can that data be improved?
So I think at the end of the day, the biggest problem in Yemen, in terms of, well, there's a few problems, but two of the biggest problems in Yemen are for data collection are related to independence of data collection and to presence in the field for data collection. I mean, at the end of the day, achieving perfect data collection in contexts such as Yemen and Afghanistan and South Sudan and many other contexts is impossible, and that shouldn't necessarily have to be the goal. But the goal needs to be to have good enough data collection that can inform decisions in a proper way. I think the first thing that would need to be done, I mean, I'm talking about going back to the basics, not even about innovation. The first thing that would need to be done in Yemen is to stop subcontracting data collection and response, for that matter, to parties to the conflict with vested interests in aid and where it goes. For example, in northern Yemen, in areas controlled by the Houthis, a lot of the data that is collected is by local authorities. It is collected by NAMCHA. It is collected by the Ministry of Education. It's collected by the Central Statistics Office. I mean, these are essentially parties to the conflict who have a vested interest in where aid goes. And if they are the ones that are collecting the data for the humanitarian response without any control or without any verification, then one cannot imagine that the data that is going to come out of that is not going to be biased given with some form of indication of where they would like that to go. I had a very interesting discussion a while back, actually, with one key informant who admitted to me that at the end of the day, even if humanitarians collect data themselves, it has to be approved by authorities. Therefore, you get a negotiation of what true data is. And I mean, if we're discussing having to negotiate what data is and what it says, then data is biased. So we really need to go back to collecting the data ourselves as a humanitarian community in an independent way, or at least independently verifying it, which means getting people into the field, decentralizing operations, getting people moving, spending time to understand what's happening themselves, rather than relying on secondary reports of what's actually out there. And at the very least, if this is not possible, there should at least be an open and transparent acknowledgement that data is biased. Because if we accept that data is biased and therefore not necessarily as reliable, you can take that into account in your analysis and make improvements in that way. Also, another thing that can be done is to just have better analytical processes. You can hire analysts and data scientists and experts in different fields, such as the economy, for example, that can help input into your analysis on what it means, the data that you have collected. Because at the end of the day, data doesn't take place in a vacuum. It's influenced by different factors that will make what you're seeing be there altogether. So not having this within the response is a detriment to actually understand what we're saying. Another thing that could be done is to stop focusing on big one-time assessments. The focus is always on negotiating for the food security, big assessments that happen once a year. There is a multi-sector assessment that they've been trying to negotiate for since 2018-19. And all the energy goes into that to the detriment of negotiating for monitoring and people being in the field and actually seeing what's going on, which is much more small scale, but can still improve a lot of knowledge and information that is out there. So I think that definitely, if we manage to get to that part, that would already greatly improve the data and the reliability of information that we're seeing. At the same time, there are for sure alternative means of data collection that are available globally now. I mean, satellite imagery has come a very long way since the early days of humanitarian response, and you can do almost everything with it now. You can see water tables, you can track crops, you can track temperature. I think it was even used to count graves at one point, at least in several contexts, to see what excess mortality was during COVID. So there are already technologies out there which can be incorporated into data gathering in the response to help inform data and knowledge and indicators. But humanitarians are not very good at incorporating non-traditional and non-standard means of data collection. So just incorporating what is already available and what has been used in other places could also be useful to help improve that.
No, I guess the response from some within the United Nations to some of these criticisms would be the context that obviously exists in Yemen and the difficulty of working on the ground there. You worked on the ground in Yemen for a period of time as well. How much can you understand some of those excuses, perhaps? And is there any justification for them?
I really can't, to be honest with you. Yemen is not the only country in the world where we work where it is difficult or where there is conflict and where there are safety concerns. And yet we still manage to be in the field much more in other contexts than in Yemen. And again, I would like to state, one of the things that's often portrayed for Yemen is that it is one of the most dangerous places in the world, if not the most dangerous place in the Middle East, as one senior humanitarian official once stated during a meeting. But this is not necessarily true. I think that most humanitarians do not feel that unsafe traveling around Yemen compared to, for example, South Sudan, where you have drunken soldiers at checkpoints. At the end of the day, I think the ability to travel and these excuses for having no access are largely self-imposed and have been perpetuated by the response itself because it's easy. And because over time, this practice has become entrenched, it has become normal, and it's very handy for authorities who prefer us not to be in the field to not have us there. And at the same time, it's easy for the security officials to not have us out in the field because it makes their life easy. I managed to travel in Yemen quite a lot. I have visited frontline areas on occasions. It is very, very much possible to travel in Yemen if you are well prepared and prepared to put in the time and the energy and the efforts, if that is what you want to do.
Thank you so much for your time today, Sarah, and thank you to the audience for listening and joining in. This podcast is part of the Sana'a Center program monitoring humanitarian aid and its micro and macroeconomic effects in Yemen. You can find us online at sana'acenter.org or on Facebook or Twitter.